Hi everyone, I'm Gertie, and thank you so much for buying my book, Gertie's Charmed Sewing Studio. Today, we're going to be showing you how to sew the Lillian Jacket, which is one of the patterns included with the book. This is a fabulous, classic 50s style peplum jacket based on the designs of Lilli Ann, a hugely collectible vintage brand. This jacket has a lot of classic but advanced techniques. So you're gonna see that it has 12 panels and it has a really shaped peplum, a beautiful shawl collar, and bound buttonholes. So it's a bit of a challenge, but it's well worth it, and definitely take your time with those skills. In the video description, you will find a handy list of timestamps to the chapters in the video. So if you need to jump around or rewatch something, that is there for you. You will also find links to the other video tutorials for the book, which are the Madeline dress and the Camille sheath. You'll also find information on how to join the Charm Patreon, which is where we release a new vintage-inspired sewing pattern every month, along with a full-length tutorial just like this one. And you'll also gain access to our entire archive of patterns on the Patreon. We're going to start with a review of the pattern pieces, so you'll be able to see all of the pattern pieces for this design laid out on the table and understand how they go together. So let's do that, and then we will get to sewing. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about our pattern pieces for the Lillian jacket. So as we always do for our patterns here at Charm, we like to take you through all the pattern pieces on the table together, and we shrink them down to 25% so you can see them together, and we'll talk through each one of them, and that will give you a sense of how they come together and if there are any special marks or anything you need to be aware of on this pattern. So I will warn you that the Lillian jacket has quite a few pieces. We did try to get it down to as few pieces as possible for a tailored jacket, but it still has quite a few pieces. And all of them need more than one fabric cut out. The entire thing is underlined in muslin for that very tailored look, and then the jacket is lined. So this means that for a lot of the pieces, you're going to be cutting fabric, underlining, and aligning. So give yourself plenty of time to do the cutting on this jacket. It will be well worth it, I promise you. Okay, so let's go through the pieces here. This is your jacket center front, and I've lined up the pieces from center front to center back, so you can get a sense of how these panels go together. So on the jacket center front, you have your roll line marked in here. That's where the shawl collar flips out. There is a dart that you need to mark at this inner corner of the shawl collar, as well as a cut line right there. And we will talk about how to sew that, but make sure that you mark those. And then you have your bound buttonholes marked here. Notches are really important in all these pieces. You just use your scissors to snip into those notch marks. For the jacket center front, you're going to cut 4 fabric and 2 underlining. Now, 2 of those fabric pieces become the facing, essentially, so the inside of the jacket, but then flips out to form the shawl collar. So if you want to do a contrast shawl collar, you would cut 2 of these pieces in your contrast fabric like we did in the color blocked version, the gray and the black velvet, okay? So what's unusual about this jacket is that it has 2 princess seams on the front and the back. So you have a seam here and then a seam here, and here's the side seam. So piece 2 is your jacket middle front, which gets sewn to the jacket center front and the jacket side front. Okay, and for this piece, 2 fabric, 2 underlining, and 2 lining. And here's your jacket side front. Now you can see this looks more like a traditional princess side piece. And these notches here, you'll see on all the pieces, mark where the waistline is. Okay, so you can see this has a very cinched look to it. And this would be the armhole here. Your side back, very similar to the side front. On all these pieces, it's going to be 2 fabric, 2 underlining, and 2 lining. Middle back, again, echoing the front here, and then your center back. So the one thing I will say about the center back is that for the lining, you do need to make a pattern adjustment. And there's an illustration of this in the book, that you're just going to need to add a vertical strip of pattern making paper to the center back, and you need to widen this piece by 1 inch and then cut it on the fold. And that's so that you can create a pleat at center back in the lining. Okay, so keep that in mind and make that adjustment before you cut your lining piece. You also have a back neck facing, 2 fabric and 2 underlining. This gets placed over the lining to finish the back neckline. And then your sleeve pieces. So this is a 2-piece sleeve, meaning that you have an undersleeve and an upper sleeve that get seamed together to create that tube-like shape. And you have notches to match these. So for each of these, 2 fabric, 2 underlining, 2 lining. But for the lining, keep in mind that you're gonna cut it at this lining cutting line because you don't want it to extend down to the fold up cuff, okay? So make sure that you take note of that. And then finally, you have your cuff facing. You can either cut this in your regular fabric that you're using for your jacket, or you could do a contrast on here since this flips up. So to give a contrast look, that would be a really nice choice. You're gonna cut 2 fabric and 2 underlining for this cuff facing. This gets seamed together, gets sewn to the sleeve lining, and then turned out to create that really cool vintage structural cuff. Okay, I know that was a lot of pieces, but keep in mind you can always go back to your pattern piece list in the book and really review that to know which pieces to cut and in what fabrics. Okay, so next we're gonna move on to your fabric and supplies. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the recommended fabric and supplies for the Lillian jacket. As always, you can go back to the book and see our full list of recommendations and supplies in one place, but I'm just going to kind of talk you through some options here, especially with the fabric. I feel like it's good to know what some of the more standard options are that work really well for this jacket. So woolens are always going to be a great choice for a tailored jacket, and for a very vintage look, I love wool flannel. This is the gray wool flannel we used for the color block version, along with a black velveteen in the book, and it looked gorgeous, and this gives you that very classic tailored look. So you're looking for woolens that are going to be around medium weight. You don't want anything too light or too heavy. You're definitely going to be avoiding things that are coating weight, right? You want to make sure to stay away from those because they'll be too bulky for this jacket. I also love velvet for this jacket. I specifically like to sew with cotton velveteen. I find it easier to work with than other like synthetics or silk velvet. So cotton velvet is going to be much easier to sew, and it will also give you a tailored look because it has a little bit more structure to it. So this is a Kaufman Kaufman cotton velveteen, which is a great choice for this jacket. And it's the one we made Susie's cherry red velvet skirt suit in with the camille sheath. This is a Harris tweed. These are pricey, but these are some of the most gorgeous wools that you can buy. You can see that tweed has this really kind of mottled texture that's really beautiful, and it presses so nicely. It shapes so nicely. When we talk about tailoring, you're looking for fabrics that are going to be somewhat moldable with steam. So tweed is a great choice for that. Now, if you're looking for something a little more lightweight, maybe summer friendly, then linen would be a really good choice. This is a plaid linen. You could also choose a cotton like a piqué or a cotton sateen or twill would be a good choice, but keep in mind that they're a little more tricky to manipulate. Wool is really easy to sculpt and mold the way you want it to with steam, and cotton isn't quite so pliable. So you're gonna have to work a little harder and really press and steam your garment. Now, these are what I would call utility fabrics that we have here. You're going to need underlining. We recommend muslin for your underlining because it gives your fabric a nice sturdiness and shape to it. So that means you're going to be layering it with your outer fabric, basting it together to create one new fabric that has a lot of structure to it and is going to give a really tailored shape. So we use in the Charm Studio this medium weight muslin that works great for underlining. And then for your bound buttonholes, you're going to need a rectangle of silk organza to finish off the little window on the inside of the jacket where the button goes through. So add that to your supply list. Silk organza is best. It's a little more steamable and workable than poly, but you can, if that's all you have, you can definitely work with poly as well. Now, you're going to want some shoulder pads. You don't have to, this is optional, but it definitely gives your shoulder a stronger look. It fills out the cap on the sleeve. It gives you that more classic 40s, 50s tailored look. And you don't have to have huge shoulder pads, right? They come in very thin varieties here. So this is only about 3/8 of an inch thick. So, and this will still give you some structure. So if you're not a huge fan of big shoulders like the Joan Crawford look, you don't have to go that structured, but you can if you want. So it's all up to you, but shoulder pads tacked in between your jacket and your lining will give you that structure. You'll need a machine sewing needle. I love Microtex needles or Universal for wovens. And you'll want to get it in the weight to match your fabric. So for tailoring fabrics, you're probably looking at 80/12 to 90/14 on your size. You'll need thread to match your fabric, and all-purpose polyester thread is perfect for this project. And finally, you will need buttons. So inch wide buttons, and you can fabric cover your own if you like. You can get one of those fabric covered button kits, or you can find some really beautiful vintagey looking buttons like these here. So you'll need 3 of those for the front of your jacket. Okay, so that's fabric and supplies, and now we are finally ready to start sewing. Okay, so we are ready to sew our bound buttonholes. Now, this is a classic vintage technique. I know a lot of people are a little scared about bound buttonholes because you are technically cutting a hole in the middle of your jacket. But it's all going to be okay because we're gonna take you through every step. And I really recommend that you practice this on scraps first, okay? So make sure that you practice first and keep in mind that the way we do bound buttonholes here at Charm is instead of having individual patches for each bound buttonhole, we have you cut one long rectangle, place it over the row of buttonholes, and then stitch them and then cut them into individual patches. I've always really liked doing it that way, so we're gonna show you how to do it that way today. Andrea's gonna show you every single step, and once you've mastered this technique, you're gonna feel so good. So let's get started. Okay, so we're ready to sew our bound buttonholes, and Andrea is sewing for us today. So we're using this patch, and in the directions, we've told you to cut a patch of fabric and organza that is 3.5 inches by 8 inches, and that's going to cover all 3 of your bound buttonholes. So you're gonna put the patch of fabric right sides together with the jacket front. And you can see that we've already underlined all of our pieces in muslin. That was step 1. We're now on to step 2 of the instructions. So just baste it around the edges, putting the muslin on the wrong side of the fabric, and then treating it as one for the rest of the steps. Okay, so now the patch is right sides together with your jacket front, and we're placing pins around each marked buttonhole. It's really important that you have your buttonholes marked really clearly on your muslin here. And so you're just putting a pin around each of the 4 sides of the buttonholes. And then you can make sure that you have a couple extra pins there to hold the patch in place. Now what we're gonna do is set our machine to a short stitch length, around 1.5. And you're gonna start on one long end of a buttonhole, sort of about halfway down. You don't wanna start in a corner. So you're gonna start stitching. You don't need to backstitch, but you can overlap your stitching. So when you get to a corner, I like to use a clear presser foot for this. If you have one for your machine, that can be really handy so you can really see your marks. Okay, so pivot at the corner, and then on the short end, you're gonna want to count your stitches so that you can do the same amount on the other short end. So you can even use your hand wheel so that you don't accidentally do too many, but count your stitches, remember that number. And now we're doing the other long side of the bound buttonhole, pivoting at the next corner. And now you'll do the exact same number of stitches that you did on your first short end. So say you counted 6 stitches on your first short end, you're gonna do the exact same number, and that will keep your rectangle looking very uniform and not slanted at all. So you have one more pivot to do, And then you can overlap your stitches on the long end that you started on. Just overlap them by about 1/4 inch is fine. And here's the sort of scary part, but it doesn't have to be scary. Remember, you can always recut this piece. It's good to have a little extra fabric just in case something goes awry. But what you're going to do is cut into the buttonhole. Cut down the center of the buttonhole to about 1/4 inch from the short end. And then you're going to cut diagonally into each short little corner there. Okay, so you're creating little triangles on the ends. So do that on one side and then repeat the same thing on the other short end, cutting diagonally into each corner. I'm going to repeat that on all 3 buttonholes. And now this long rectangular strip that we used as our patch, we're going to cut that into individual patches now. So cut the patch down in between each of the buttonholes. And this will create 3 separate patches, 1 for each buttonhole. And if you have excess on the ends, you can cut it down a little bit. And now we're going to turn each of these individual patches to the wrong side of the jacket. So just turn it through the hole that you created with your cutting. When I didn't mention that what you want to be using is some short, sharp scissors for this. So embroidery scissors are great for cutting those bound buttonholes. Okay, so now you can see we've created these little rectangular openings. Which is exactly what we want. And now we're going to be forming the lips of the buttonholes by hand. So bound buttonholes are like tiny little welt pockets, and then they look like weird little mouths. So you're going to be actually hand forming 2 lips by hand. So just use your fingers to manipulate the fabric into an upper and lower lip like Andrea is doing here. And then once you're happy with the way that they look, then you can pin in place diagonally at each corner. And my favorite way to stitch a bound buttonhole, to stitch the lips in place, is by hand. So that's what we're going to show you next. You can do this by machine, and some instructions will have you do this by machine, but it's a lot harder to have control with a machine stitch on this step. So that's why we like to do it by hand. All right, so you're going to thread a needle. And the first thing we're going to do is you're going to baste the lips closed. So really, you just want a little whip stitch across the lips to hold them in place. This is kind of like when you buy a coat and the welt pocket is stitched closed to hold it in place until you open it. It's the same idea. It's just to hold these lips in place until the final press, and then you reveal your finished jacket. Okay, so that's just to baste the lips closed, which you will eventually open up. And now we're going to do a stitch to actually hold the lips in place permanently, stitching around the outer rectangle in the ditch. Okay, so I like to use, you can use a tiny little running stitch for this. You can use a prick stitch. But the point is, no matter what you use, you want to be stitching exactly in the ditch of the rectangle, securing the lips in place. So take your time with this. You are stitching around that outer rectangle, which is holding the lips in place. And then you're going to tie off your thread. And you really want to feel confident that your lips are secure here. So take your time. You can see Andrea is just using a tiny little running stitch, just passing the needle through top to bottom. And now she's going to knot it off on the underside. And then we have a final step, which is to secure underneath here. So see how if we fold the jacket back, there's a little triangle that's exposed, which is where we cut diagonally into the rectangle. So you want to fold the jacket back, and we're going to stitch by machine across that little rectangle. So you can pin the jacket back just so that you have the tiny little triangle showing. And now we're going to stitch it in place. So go to your machine and use your short stitch again, and you can back stitch on both sides of this, but start a little above and end a little below that little triangle. And do that on each side, securing your tiny triangles. And now you're going to repeat all those steps on your other two buttonholes. And finally, you're just going to want to give a nice press to the right side and use a press cloth and a little steam. And there is one finished buttonhole. Okay, so now we're on to step 3, if you're following along in the book instructions, and hopefully you are. So what we're going to be doing next is sewing this dart that goes underneath the shawl collar. And this is a fun little design trick that helps the collar roll correctly. So you should have done the reinforcement stitching, as you can see in the illustration at step 3, and then clip diagonally to that point. Now we have this tiny little dart to stitch here. So you're going to fold the jacket in half, right sides together, and then match the dart legs from top to bottom. So you're going to put a pin through on the upper layer and then just check on the under layer that your pin is aligned through both lines of the dart. And now we're going to stitch from the circle, or that clip, down to the point of the dart. So start exactly at that circle where you clip to, and then stitch down the dart legs. And when you get to the point of the dart, don't backstitch. You're going to leave a couple extra inches of thread here. Just veer off the fabric very gradually, leave some tails, and then we're going to tie those by hand. And now we're going to use a curved surface. This is a great use for your tailor's ham to press your dart towards center front. And now we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so we're moving on to step 4, which is sewing the front princess seams. This jacket is unusual because it actually has 2 front princess seams. So we have an armhole princess seam and a shoulder princess seam. So this is something I really loved from vintage Lillian jackets, and I want to incorporate into this design. So that means we're going to be sewing 2 princess seams for the front and 2 for the back on each side. So, because we have 12 panels total. So lots of princess seams. Now, first thing you want to do is clip into your seam allowances. Normally we would say to stay stitch your seam allowances, and you can certainly do that, but you have your basting stitches from your underlining, right? So you can also use that as your stay stitching and just clip to your stay stitching or your basting stitches. So you always want to clip the side that's straighter. So in this case, the clips are on the jacket center front piece. And we're now pinning the jacket center front to the jacket middle front. And you're matching your notches, and you can mark in those notches ahead of time because it does get confusing when you start making clips into your seam allowances. You can use a little disappearing ink marker to make a mark where those notches are so you can still match them. And now you're just going to slightly spread those clips on the jacket center front to match the jacket middle front. There's not so much easing on this piece because the bust curve, as you can really see on the piece that's laying on the surface there, the majority of the bust curve is in the jacket side front. So we're going to need to do more easing on the next princess seam, but just slight easing on this one. So you want to make sure that it matches up at the shoulder seam. And just ease in between all those match points using lots of pins. And now we're going to stitch from the shoulder seam down to the hem at 5/8 of an inch, and you're using your regular stitch length here, 2.5. So if you're still on your bound buttonhole stitch length, make sure to change it. And there's a slight pivot at the waistline. This is a very curvy jacket, so you could see that Andrea just slightly pivoted the work as she got to the waistline, so you're going to want to watch out for that. Okay, so now you can do, if you want, I don't think it's totally necessary on this piece, but if you had a very curvy piece that you were sewing to, you could do notches, right? So if you had like a sort of roughly seam allowance because it was so full from a curve, you would do notches on that side. But here we're just pressing open, giving a little bit of steam. Okay, so now we have sewn our shoulder princess seam. That's the seam that goes to the shoulder. And now we're going to sew the one that goes to the armhole, also known as the armhole princess seam. So we're sewing that center front unit to the jacket side front. So starting at the waistline notch and going down, and you're going to want to make sure that you've clipped into the straighter side that you're pinning here. So the straight edge of the jacket middle front, because we're going to clip into those seam allowances about every 1/2 inch, and then you're going to want to spread those clips to match the curve of the jacket side front. So you can really see how Andrea is sort of smushing down the middle piece and spreading open those clips so that it matches the curve of the bust on the jacket side front. And that will help you perfectly ease together those two pieces along the princess seam. And now we're starting at the armhole and stitching at 5/8 of an inch down to the hemline. And don't forget to just pivot slightly at the waistline clip. And now we'll press this seam open as well. And now here, you could definitely do the jacket side front. You can see it's a little roughly on that seam allowance. You could definitely do some notches, so cutting out some triangles at the seam allowance between where the clips are, if you have a lot of ruffling and excess there. Now you're going to press that seam open. Of course, you're going to repeat all of this on the other side of the jacket front, but there's 2 completed princess seams. And next we'll be moving on to step 5. The next thing we're going to be doing is stitching the center back seam on the shawl collar. So you're going to take your 2 jacket fronts and put them right sides together at that short center back seam. Now you want to make sure that you have your roll line marked in on the wrong side of your fabric on the muslin. And you're going to stitch that little center back seam at 5/8 of an inch, clip at the roll line mark because there is a sort of slight curve there, and press those seam allowances open. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn the lapel out along the roll line and give it a little press. Now you don't want to press a sharp crease in here. You want to more sort of steam gently without pressing down hard. The other thing that you can do, which I really like to do, is sort of wrap the jacket around a ham, like the ham is a neck or something, or you can put it on your dress form and wrap it around and pin it like your ham is wearing the jacket, and then just kind of let it dry like that. Or you can just kind of shape it freeform like Andrea is doing here. And there is your jacket front unit. We're ready to move on to the back. Okay, so now we're on to step 6. You're going to take your 2 jacket center backs and you're going to pin them right sides together. And again, just to reiterate, these pieces are underlined with muslin. None of these seams need to be finished like with serging or anything like that because this is a fully lined garment. So we're pinning these together along the center back seam. And now you're going to stitch from the neckline down to the hemline at 5/8 of an inch. And you're just going to press this seam allowance open. And then in the next step, we'll be doing the back princess seams. Okay, so now we're going to sew these back princess seams just like we did for the front. Again, we have 2 princess seams on each side for a total of 4 princess seams on this back. So we have an armhole princess seam and then a shoulder princess seam on each side. So again, the straighter side with less curve to it. Of course, there isn't as much curve as there is on the front of the jacket because there's no bust. But the straighter side, you will want to clip about every 1/2 inch so that you're able to spread those clips to match the curvier side of the seam that you're sewing. So putting those 2 pieces right sides together, spreading your clips as needed, and then filling in pins to ease the 2 pieces together along the shoulder princess seam. And a good rule of thumb is that you want to always stitch from the side with the clips because it's easier to keep an eye on them to make sure that they don't actually fold underneath your presser foot and get stitched down weird. So you want to put your pins on the clip side and then stitch from that side as well. So it doesn't matter whether you stitch from the top down or the bottom up, just I would say stitch with the clips on top. And now we're stitching those 2 pieces together at 5/8 of an inch. And next we'll press open. So we're just going to show you this one princess seam on the back because you've probably got the idea by now. There's a lot of princess seams on this jacket. So we're going to continue with the rest of the back princess seams and then move on to the next step. Okay, so now that we've sewn the front and back units, we're going to sew them to each other. So this is a really cool skill to have for any shawl collar. We're going to be stitching the front to the back all in one seam. So the back neckline and the shoulder seams all together. So we're going to take this a step at a time. You're going to be putting them right sides together. And you have your dart, and you should have coordinating circles on the center back, or on the back neckline. So make sure that your seam lines match up. You're putting these right sides together, and we're matching those shoulder princess seams from front to back. I'm putting a pin there, and pinning along the rest of the shoulder seam. And next you're going to go onto your dart, which should exactly match the circle or the pivot point on the back neckline. So place a pin there. And now you're going to pin the back neckline to the front shawl collar seam. That's the center back seam where we sewed the two fronts together. And you're going to want to clip into the back neckline so you can spread those clips to match the front, kind of like we did on the princess seams. So you're pinning along the back neckline to the opposite dart and then the opposite little shoulder seam, matching that shoulder princess seam as well. So we've pinned all the way across the back neckline and the shoulder seams. And you're going to start stitching at one side, and you're going to have to back stitch at your dart, break your stitching, and start on the opposite side of the dart. Just fold it out of the way. So don't stitch your dart down. You want the dart to remain free. So continuing to stitch around the back neckline. Here is our center back seam on the shawl collar. Again, breaking your stitching on the dart and starting on the other side, folding the dart out of the way. Okay, so that is how you sew a shawl collar seam. That's the traditional way that it's done. And now you're going to press that seam open. So the shoulder seam gets pressed open and the back neckline as well. So it can help to use a ham here, not because it's a curved seam, but it just helps to have a raised surface to really isolate this sort of fiddly area here. So you can see we pressed open the back neckline and the opposite shoulder seam. And that is our back neckline seam. Okay, so this is a nice, easy little step, and it's just sewing the side seams of the jacket. So match at the notches at the waistline, other sets of notches, and then the underarm and the hem, and then just fill in pins in between. And now we're going to stitch from the armhole down. And there's a slight little, I'm not going to call it a pivot point exactly, but this has a very flared hem, this jacket, because it has this little peplum without a waistline seam. So there is a slight little pivot that you're going to do at the waistline. So just be aware of that. Slight little curve there. And then you're going to clip into that notch there to the seam line and press that seam allowance open. And that is your side seam. So repeat on the other side. Okay, so we're moving right along to sleeves. This is step 10. Now, like a classic tailored jacket, we have a two-piece sleeve on the Lillian jacket. So there's an upper panel and a lower panel. And we're gonna put them right sides together. And first we're gonna sew the underarm or the inner sleeve seam. So this is the straighter seam allowance, and it doesn't have the cuff opening, okay? So you're going to sew this all the way from the underarm down to the hem. On the other side, it has more of a pivot point for the cuff, and we're going to sew it a little bit differently because we don't sew the entire seam. We leave an opening for that beautiful cuff detail. But on this side, the first side we're stitching, the underarm, you're going to pin all the way from top to bottom, and then we're going to stitch. And now press open. And now we're going to sew the other seam. So we're only going to stitch down to that cuff circle. So match your notches and pin. And then you can match the other set of notches. And then go up to the sleeve cap, and you're going to notice that there's a bit of a seam allowance that hangs over at the upper edge, a sort of sharp triangle up there, and that's totally fine as long as everything matches at the 5 of an 8 seam line. That's what you're looking for. Okay, so we're going to start stitching at the top and then only go as far as the circle at the cuff and then back stitch. So we're going to back stitch here and then leave open below that. And this gets turned back to form that beautiful cuff, which I took directly by studying Lillian Ann jackets. This was a really common feature in those jackets. So clip to the cuff circle and then press open from the cuff circle up. And one thing to note here is that there's that seam allowance that overhangs. That's totally fine, but everything else should match at the seam line. And then you have a notch for your sleeve, for your shoulder seam at the top there. And then your other notch for the side seam of the jacket is in the center of that lower panel on the sleeve. So just note that. Okay, so next we're going to be going into sewing the sleeve cuff. I love this cuff so much. It's a really cool vintage detail, has a slit in it, and it gets turned up to create a really dimensional shape. So Andrea's going to show you step by step how to sew it. How it's going to work is you're going to be sewing the cuff into a ring, the sleeve lining into a ring, and then sewing them together so you have a nice clean finish on the inside. And then it gets sewn right sides together with the outer sleeve. Now it's very important that you mark the circle on the cuff because that's where the slit starts. And also it's really important that you grade your seam allowances well and that you clip to that circle point. So you're going to see every step next. You've got this, just take it one step at a time. Okay, so we're looking at steps 11 and 12 in this little chapter. So step 11 is to sew your sleeve lining the same as for the outer sleeve. Now, the sleeve lining, you have a cut mark for where you're going to cut it off because it doesn't extend all the way down to the cuff. So it's shorter than the outer sleeve. So keep that in mind, but you are going to sew those two seams all the way down to the hem. And then we have a facing to finish off the cuff. So you're going to fold that into a little ring here, right sides together. And it's the same thing as the outer sleeve. You don't want to sew below that cuff circle. So as you can see, it follows the same shape as the cuff on the sleeve, sort of angling out there. And you're only going to sew from that cuff circle to that upper edge there. So just a short little bit of sewing to do here. Stitch at 5/8 of an inch, back stitch on both sides of this little seam. And now we're going to clip again to the cuff circle and press open where it's stitched. So you can see how it's forming the same sort of idea as the sleeve. And that is it for the cuff. And next we'll move on to the next step in the sleeve. Okay, so now we're going to put the cuff facing together with the sleeve lining. So they're going to get stitched right sides together. So one way to do it is you can put the cuff facing inside the sleeve lining like Andrea is doing, right sides together. And you want to make sure that you align them correctly. So the opening on the cuff or the flared side should align with the longer seam on the sleeve lining so that the opening on the cuff is on the outside of the arm. You can pin them together along that little ring, little circular seam here. And now we're going to stitch them together. So if you have a free arm on your machine, this is a handy way to use it like we are here. You can also stitch from the inside of the circle if you don't have a free arm. Some vintage machines don't have a free arm, so you might need to do that. Okay, so now you're just going to pull the cuff away from the sleeve lining, and we're going to press the cuff up towards, those seam allowances get pressed towards the sleeve lining. If your fabric is real bulky, you can trim one down, kind of grade those seam allowances. But if you're using a thinner suiting like we are, it's probably fine. And now we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so this is step 14. We are sewing the sleeve/cuff unit to the sleeve at the hem. So this gets finished along the hem first, and then the sleeve gets set into the jacket. So this is actually easier than you think it's going to be, which is a nice change on this jacket. You're pinning the two pieces right sides together at the hem, and you want to make sure to match the cuff circles where you've clipped in, where they open up at that sort of flared part there. And now we're going to stitch starting at one cuff circle, and then these are real tight curves, so just take it slow around here. And the other side of that curve. And then you're going to finish at the opposite cuff circle where it opens up. And now you can just make sure that you've clipped all the way to the stitching at the cuff circles. And you're going to grade your seam allowances. So the jacket seam allowance, you can trim down to about 1/8 of an inch here. And then the facing seam allowance can be about 1/4 inch. That'll help remove some of the bulk in these seam allowances here. And now you can do some little notches around those curves, and then turn the lining to the inside of the sleeve. And now you can see Andrea's just sort of working out at those little curves, turning those little curves right side out. And now this is too small an area to understitch, so you're really going to have to be careful with your pressing here. So really use your fingers to roll out the seam lines to the edges and press these flat. Okay, so press all the way around, and then that's your completed cuff hem. Okay, so now we're looking at steps 15 and 16 in this chapter. So in step 15, we already basted the sleeve lining to the outer sleeve along the sleeve cap. Okay, so now those two layers of the sleeve are one. In some patterns, you might keep the sleeve lining free, but in this one, we're going to set them in together as one. So you're going to baste them together. You also want to do 2 rows of easing stitches along the sleeve cap. So around the curvy part, you're going to make sure you have 2 rows of long basting stitches, 1 at 1/4 inch and 1 at 1/2 an inch, just standard for setting in a sleeve. And now we are pinning the sleeve into the jacket armhole, right sides together. And you just want to note, we started at the underarm, right? And this is not a typical underarm because we don't have an underarm seam on the sleeve. We have that underarm panel, or the under sleeve, I think it's called. So you're going to match the notch to the side seam of the jacket. Okay, so just note that, and then you have more notches to match. So you're going to start by pinning around the under arm. And then we can go to the cap, or that curvy part where you've put your easing stitches. So first match the notch at the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam on the jacket. And then you're going to start to pull up your easing stitches, also known as basting stitches, just a long stitch, 4 to 5 millimeters. Pull those 2 sets of stitches up, those 2 rows. And again, just anytime you're easing a set in sleeve like this, you will see ruffling, and you can see very well on the sleeve here where Andrea pulled up those basting stitches. You're getting a sort of roughly seam allowance there, but we're not doing a gathered sleeve cap, okay? You don't want to see any gathers along the seam line. You just want it to see it be slightly eased up and some ruffling along the outer edge, the raw edge. And now we're going to sew around the armhole. So start around the underarm. You can start at one of the princess seams. And you can see we're stitching from the jacket side. making sure your seam allowances stay pressed open and stitching all the way around the sleeve. And you can see we got a little pucker there, so Andrew's going to go back and fix that. But then the next thing to do is to just trim down the seam allowance of your underarm to about 3/8 of an inch, and then press the sleeve cap towards the sleeve. Shoulder pads. These are really nice to add just to give a sort of more refined appearance of the shoulder line and the upper chest on a tailored jacket. And it's nice to put them between the jacket and the lining, but of course you could also tack them in later if you decide you want them later in the process. So you could tack them to the lining instead. But it's nice to have them hidden. So you're going to take the sort of straight side of the shoulder pad and it gets aligned with the armhole seam. And we're just pinning in place in a few places at the shoulder seam and then tacking down those edges. So in just a few places. And you want to make sure to hand tack to the seam allowances, not to the jacket itself. And that is it. That's your shoulder pads placed into the jacket between the lining and the jacket. All right, so next we're going to show you how to sew the lining back pleat. Now, jackets often have a pleated back lining for range of motion when you wear the jacket. Now, we didn't want to have to make you print an extra pattern piece, and it's a good skill to have. So in the book, we show you how to add that pleat to the center back of your lining piece, just adding that extra inch vertically at center back. And now we're going to show you how to sew it. So you're going to create the pleat, and then you're going to stitch it closed at the neckline and then the waistline and below. So it will open up across the back where you need that movement as you wear the jacket. Okay, so remember that you have added that extra inch to your jacket lining back as we show on page 191 of the book. And then what we've already done here is sewn those two center back pieces, the lining pieces, together at 5/8 of an inch from neckline down to the hem. And now we're going to create this pleat. So you want to mark an inch in from your 5/8 of an inch seam, so from your stitching. So from the neckline down to 2 inches below the neckline. So you can just give yourself a nice mark there, a nice stitching line there. And then we're going to sew from the waist down an inch in from the seam again. And so you're going to give yourself a stitching line from the waist down to the hem, and it should be parallel to the seam line an inch away from it. So these are our stitching lines for the pleat. So now we're just pinning the layers together to make sure they don't shift while we're stitching. And so we're stitching from the neckline down 2 inches as marked. Break your stitching and then start again at the waistline mark and stitch down to the hem. And now you're going to press that pleat and the seam allowances to one side. It doesn't matter which side, just to one side. So from the waist down and then your little 2-inch section at the neckline. You don't have to press in between there, though you can if you want. And so now you can see what we have here is a pleat that opens up between the neckline and the waistline to give you that range of movement in the lining. Okay, so now we're moving on to steps 19 and 20, and there is a little issue in the instructions with this. They're a little bit out of order. You have to do step 20 first, which we've done here, which is assembling all of the lining princess seams and the side seams, and then just leave the lining shoulder seams open. And now, looking at step 19, we have turned under the lower edge of the back neckline facing, which is interfaced, by the way. Turned under that lower edge 5/8 of an inch, and now you're placing it over the back lining, matching up the neckline edge and along the shoulder seams there. So this just gets placed flat on top of the back lining unit, and then we're going to edge stitch along the lower edge of the facing to attach it to the lining. So you can see what Andrea is doing here is pinning all along the lower curved edge of the back neckline facing, just to hold it in place for edge stitching, which we're going to do next. Okay, so about 1/8 of an inch from that folded in lower edge of the back neckline facing, just holding everything nice and flat. You are stitching just along that lower edge. And now you're going to baste the rest of the unit in place here, the rest of the facing in place. So around the neckline edge and around those little short shoulder seams, just use a long basting stitch. This is eventually going to get caught in a seam anyway, but we do want everything to be attached here temporarily. So stitching around at about 1/2 an inch is fine. This is a basting stitch. Just going to attach the facing to the lining. And there's your back lining with the facing attached. And now you'll be able to sew those shoulder seams. So as you can see, the lining side seams are already sewn. Okay, so now we can move on to step 21 before we sew those shoulder seams. You want to attach the front facing, and keep in mind that this one is not underlined, but it does have the dart sewn, that little pivot point in the dart, just like the jacket center front. And this is essentially another princess seam, just like we did on the jacket front. So you're going to put it together with the lining, matching notches, circles, etc., and clipping if needed, and stitching from the top down to the hem. And now we're going to press these seam allowances towards the front facing. And next we'll move on to step 22. Okay, so now you're able to go on and sew the shoulder seams on the lining and the back neckline seam. And that's exactly the same as you did for the outer jacket. So remember pinning those shoulder seams, clipping the back neckline, and making sure that you don't stitch down the darts, right? So stitching to either side of the dart, breaking your stitching. So now the next step is to stay stitch around the lining armholes at 5/8 of an inch. And this can just be your regular stitch length. And now you're going to clip in. And then press in your seam allowances to the wrong side. And this is because we're going to slip stitch this, so it's going to be hand stitching on the inside of the jacket to finish those seams on the inside of the armhole. So that everything is very beautifully and professionally concealed at the armhole. So there's your turned in seam allowance. And now we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we need to create little windows on the front facing for the buttonholes, because as it is, your buttons aren't going to be able to pass through the inside of your jacket through those beautiful bound buttonholes that you made, because the facing is going to be covering the inside. So a kind of fussy and sort of beautiful thing about bound buttonholes is that you also need to create little windows on your facings. So some books or instructions will have you do this just by stay stitching around the rectangles and then cutting into them and then turning the seam allowances to the wrong side, which you can totally do. This is a nicer way to do it, I think, because it's just a bit cleaner. So you're using that patch of organza that we talked about way back in the bound buttonhole chapter, and you're pinning it right sides together with the facing, just like we did with those bound buttonholes. So the process is pretty similar here. And now we're just making sure that our windows are perfectly marked. It's very important that everything's very accurate here so that it matches up with the outside of your jacket. So we've placed pins around each little rectangle, and now you're going to stitch along one long side. Yeah, you're going to start on one long side just like we did on the outside of the jacket. You're going to count your stitches on each short end, stitch around those little rectangles. And again, you're using a short stitch length here, so about 1.5. And then you cut your organza into separate little windows, 3 little patches. Cut into the window through the center and then diagonally into each corner, about 1/4 inch from the end. Flip it through to the wrong side. And then instead of creating lips like we did with the bound buttonhole, you're just going to create a little window. So sort of press it out like that to form that little rectangle with clean edges, and then, yeah, press flat. So once we get to the final finishing stages, you will hand stitch these to the inside of the bound buttonholes to create a little window for your buttons to pass through. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the lining unit to the jacket unit. So we're going to be stitching them around the front opening edges and then around the shawl collar. So you're leaving it open around the hem, so around the bottom. So pinning everything right sides together, make sure you're matching that center back seam on the shawl collar. And pinning all the way up one front opening around the shawl collar and back neckline, and then down around the opposite front opening to the hem. And now we're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch all the way around from hem to hem. Okay, and now we're going to do a little bit of grading. You want to clip in at each roll line. And now we're going to grade. So the sort of unusual thing, or the thing to note about a jacket with a lapel, is that you need to reverse the grading rule from one side to the other. So below the roll line, you are going to make the facing the narrower seam allowance, and the jacket the longer one. And then above the roll line, that reverses. So the jacket is the narrower seam allowance, and then the facing is the slightly wider one. That's because the lapel is going to flip out, so it changes direction, which means that all the rules change right at the roll line. So you're going to do your grading, and next we're going to understitch. And again, your understitching rule is also going to change. So below the roll line, you're going to understitch on the facing, and then you're going to give yourself a couple inches. You don't want to stitch right up to the roll line on either side. Above the roll line, you're going to stitch on the jacket because you don't want the understitching to be visible. So the thing to note is that when you get to that roll line, which you have a crease marked in there, so you should be able to see it, and we're looking at it right now, that little crease on the underside, that's where your understitching changes from the facing to the jacket itself. So we're just putting a little pin there to note that. And now we're understitching the facing, just making sure that we are holding those seam allowances, or holding everything taut, and then making sure that the seam allowances are underneath your stitching. And then when you get to that pin, you're just going to need to change which side you're stitching on. And now we're going to press this whole outer edge. So just sort of rolling the understitching out and pressing that edge. Always a good idea to use a silk organza press cloth to protect your wool fabric, or whatever type of fabric you're using, but wool can get those shiny spots, so you just want to be really careful not to press directly on it. And there is a little bit of your understitched front. And then you're going to repeat that. You're going to continue with that pressing all the way around. Okay, so now we're finally at some finishing work, which is pretty intense for this jacket, but just take your time with it. Enjoy the process. There's a lot of hand stitching. So as you know, we always say, just put on your favorite TV program and get a nice cup of tea and settle into this, because you have a lot of hand stitching to do around the armholes here to start. So remember how we turned in the seam allowances around the armholes on the lining? Now you're going to pin it to the sleeves here. So you're covering up those sleeve seam allowances to get a nice finish here. So the seam allowances are going to be completely enclosed between the layers, and you're pinning in that turned in seam allowance all the way around. Make sure that you're matching your notches and any seams to make sure that nothing gets twisted on the inside of your jacket. And then once you're happy with your pinning, you're going to hand stitch this. So you'll want to slip stitch just sort of between the layers here. You don't want your stitching to be visible. So you're just going to take a little stitch on one side and then tunnel through the folded in seam allowance on the armscye of the jacket. And just going all the way around like that. And you want to take relatively small stitches because you want this to be nice and secure while you're wearing the jacket. And continue like that all the way around the armhole. And next we're going to be moving along to hemming the jacket. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the hem. So this jacket has an inch hem allowance. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold it in, just the jacket, not the lining yet, an inch. And because there's so much flare to this hem, because it is a peplum, it's not a bad idea to pin just at, say, the seam lines, because we have so many panels here. So pin at the seam lines, and then you'll have some slack in between the seam lines because of that curve. So Andrea's sharing a really good tip here, which is one way to create a sort of flat hem, even with all that flare on the inside, is to create some easing on the inside. And because we have the basting stitches from when you attach your underlining, the muslin layer, to your outer jacket, you can use a pin and sort of pull up those underlining basting stitches, which will create some easing and help that edge lay flat on the inside. So it will sort of look eased in on the inside of the jacket. See how it looks slightly crimped where she's pinned it to the right there. But then on the right side of the jacket, it will look totally flat. So this is a technique for hemming anything that has a lot of flare to it and a deeper hem. So say you were doing a circle skirt or something like that, you would need to, if you wanted to do a deeper hem, you would need to somehow create a little bit of sort of like a crimped, eased hem on the inside. So one way to do that is with these easing stitches. Another way could be to just create tiny little pleats on the hem on the inside only. And then once you've done that all the way around the jacket hem, then you're going to stitch the hem up to the jacket, and you want to just make sure to only stitch through the underlining, okay, not the jacket itself, because we don't want this to show on the right side. And then you're just going to hand stitch like that all the way around, and it won't show on the outside of your jacket. Be careful not to pull these stitches tight at all, because then you'll get some puckers. So it can be a relatively loose stitch here without pulling on the thread at all. And then the next thing, once you finish the jacket, is to do the front facing, which will also get turned up an inch, just like the rest of the jacket. So turn up that little front facing section there, 1 inch, and press in place. And that will get folded into the inside of the jacket like this, and then you'll hand stitch between the layers. And next we just need to focus on the lining. So the lining gets turned up 1.5 inches, so it's 1/2 inch shorter than the jacket itself. So that's quite a bit, and it does get a little unwieldy in here, so just take your time, but you kind of slant it up from the facing up to 1.5 inches. And again, you're going to need to do some little pleats or easing on that hem because it's quite deep for such a flared hem. And then you're going to turn the facing and the lining to the inside of the jacket and pin it in place. So the facing, like so, that's pretty easy. It just gets turned in. But then on the lining, you want the lining to be 1/2 inch shorter than the jacket. So it needs to kind of slant up here from where the facing is, and then you're going to pin it in place. And when you go to stitch these two together, this needs to be hand stitched as well. You're gonna kind of lift up the flap here, kind of create a flap, that little edge, and stitch between the layers very, very loosely. So you're creating a sort of free edge on that lining. So you're gonna go through all those steps to do your hemming, and then move on to final finishing steps. Okay, so this is step 27. We just need to hand stitch those little windows to the inside of the bound buttonholes. So you're going to want to make sure that everything aligns here and the window is just sort of framing the inside of the bound buttonhole. You're going to pin it in place, and then we're going to do a tiny little hand stitch between these two layers. You're going to just stitch like that all the way around. And then repeat that for all 3 buttonholes. And then your beautiful bound buttonholes will be finished on both sides. Final step on this journey is to sew on your buttons. So we do have button marks, which correspond to the buttonholes, of course, but you may want to put this on a dress form or put it on yourself and then pin the jacket closed and mark your button location. Is never a bad idea. So you're just going to hand stitch those buttons on, and then you are finished. Just a few easy steps on this little jacket here, and we're done. Okay, so that was it, your Lillian jacket. I hope you've loved learning how to sew this gorgeous classic jacket. And don't forget, we have a hack of this jacket in the book with color blocking, which gives it a really beautiful paneled hourglass effect. I can't wait to see what you make with this pattern, so please do tag me on social media. I'm at Gertie18 on Instagram, and you can use the hashtags Lillian Jacket and Charmed Sewing Studio. And don't forget that in the description, you'll find links to the other videos for the book, which are the Madeline dress and the Camille sheath. So thank you so much for watching and for buying the book, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.